Get me Will Trent.
ABC Tuesday.
I don't even know where he is.
Will Trent is back.
You thought you could hide forever? Time to come home.
The series that's being called one of the best network procedurals.
We're going to solve this case.
Featuring new cast member Gina Rodriguez.
I'm a prosecutor. We deal in truth and facts.
Maybe everybody should try that, huh?
Will Trent, the 2-part season premiere, begins Tuesday on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. As he made his daily walk throughout Boston, collecting rent payments from his tenants, Dr. George Parkman stopped by a grocery store for a couple of pantry staples, butter and sugar. The year was 1849, though, so this stop to the corner shop likely isn't quite what you're picturing. Sugar wasn't automatically sold in granulated form back then, nor did it always come in prepackaged bags. Butter, too, was ordered a bit differently, and Parkman needed a lot of both because Thanksgiving was only a few days away. So the doctor told the shopkeeper precisely what he wanted that Friday afternoon. "I require crushed sugar, Mr. Holland," he said. He wanted the expensive type, the white kind, and he wanted 32 pounds of it. Holland didn't have a big enough receptacle on hand, so Parkman suggested a nearby bucket. Then he insisted that Holland weigh the bucket, not once, not twice, but 3 times to make sure he only paid for the sugar and wasn't charged extra for the weight of the bucket. Parkman was known to do things like that. He was quite a rich man, worth $500,000 in 1849 money. Today, that translates to about $20 million. And he wasn't one of those spend freely rich types. He lived in a nice home but didn't own a horse because he considered that a waste of money when he could just walk places for free. All that daily walking not only saved him dough, but it helped him stay fit. He was tall, slim, and lanky, with a noticeably protruding chin that jutted forward, seemingly leading the way for the rest of his body. As for the butter Parkman needed, the store stocked it by the firkin, a wooden quarter barrel that kept 56 pounds of the stuff. Parkman asked for 6 pounds to be cut off the firkin. This is where the doctor's lack of a horse was inconvenient to others. He couldn't very well walk with 38 pounds of sugar and butter back home, so he asked Holland to deliver it. Holland agreed. Then Parkman paid for one more item, a single head of lettuce, likely for his sick daughter who couldn't handle anything but bland foods. Now that he could carry on his own, but he wasn't quite done with his rent collecting rounds, so he asked Holland to hold on to it for a few minutes until he got back from one final errand. Holland obliged. But by day's end, that head of lettuce was still sitting in a bag waiting for its owner. Parkman never returned for it. Soon, the doctor's family reported him as missing. It wasn't like him not to return home after his rounds. His employee, Charles Kingsley, had prepped lunch for him back at his house, as he did every day around 3 p.m. Usually, after he ate, Parkman would apprise Kingsley of matters related to his various rental properties around town and other business dealings in the works. Parkman would apprise Kingsley of matters related to his various rental properties around town and other business dealings in the works. It was odd that he never showed up. Kingsley came back around dinner time, but there was still no sign of his boss. This was getting worrisome. Parkman rarely missed any appointment, period, but especially not meal times. Kingsley began replaying their last chat earlier that morning when Parkman said he had been called for an appointment around midday. Kingsley usually knew the ins and outs of his boss's daily meetings, especially the who's, but this time he hadn't heard who had summoned him for the late addition to his itinerary. The next morning, when Parkman still hadn't returned, Kingsley knew something terrible had happened. He wasn't sure what, but when all was eventually revealed, it would be a national scandal that not only made headlines around the globe, but tarnished the reputation of America's oldest Ivy League university. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Hiya Health. So, Scott, when we got serious as a couple, you became a stepdad. Is it everything you dreamed?
Actually, it's way more rewarding than I thought possible.
It can be frustrating, too, though. Like, how fun is it to get the kiddo to eat healthy food?
That part's been surprising. He will just not eat a lot of the time. I don't understand it.
That's why I got him taking Hiya vitamins. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kid needs with a yummy taste he loves.
Aren't a lot of vitamins basically candy in disguise?
They sure are. That's why Hiya created a super-powered chewable vitamin. It's made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy additives.
Really? What's in it?
Actually, here, read this list.
Vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, many others to help support the immune system, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more.
Good job. My kiddo loves the taste. Now, we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/COTC. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/COTC and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. Harvard University is America's oldest college. In fact, it's older than America. Established in 1636, the Cambridge, Massachusetts institution was first named New College, then later renamed Harvard College after John Harvard, a Puritan minister whose personal library and half of his estate were endowed to the institution a few years later. The Reverend John Harvard's life story is a tragic one. He'd been born to a big family in modern-day London, the fourth of 9 children sired by a butcher and tavern owner. Fun fact, Harvard's grandfather served on their neighborhood's corporation council with John Shakespeare, William's father. Not so fun fact, by 1625, most of the Harvard family had been wiped out by the bubonic plague. Only John, a brother, and their mother Catherine were left. Harvard was a big believer in higher education, having received his master's from Cambridge University in England. With some inherited money and property, he immigrated to the New World in 1637. He didn't live here long, though. After surviving the bubonic plague, this poor guy got sick with tuberculosis within 2 years of arriving and died in 1638. In recognition of his generosity to the colony's first college, the place was renamed Harvard College the next year. It started as a religiously affiliated institution, but got its first non-clergy leader by way of John Leverett in 1708. Here's some super sexy sounding backstory, courtesy of the History on Maps YouTube channel.
Its curriculum and student body were gradually secularized during the 18th century, and by the 19th century, Harvard had emerged as the central cultural establishment among Boston elites.
You might think Harvard's a bit hoity-toity now, but you should have seen it in George Parkman's day. By then, it was nearly 200 years old and, without question, the most revered college in the country. The students entering Harvard in 1849 included John Quincy Adams, who had been named after the nation's 6th president, who in turn had been son to the nation's second president. That kind of lineage wasn't uncommon in Harvard's classrooms. The college did allow exemplary students from poor backgrounds, but once you were accepted into the school, you were expected to behave like you belonged to one of the most elite institutions, because you did. George Parkman, born in 1790, had been a sickly child born to well-off parents. He entered Harvard as a freshman when he was just 15 years old, which sounds nuts, but was pretty common back then. After he graduated in 1809, he worked as a medical surgeon for the Massachusetts militia. As tight-fisted as he was about his resources as an adult, he'd been a generous doctor. When Boston endured smallpox and cholera outbreaks, he loaned out some of his properties as field hospitals. Which is saying something because those properties were his real moneymakers. Doctors were paid maybe $1.50 per house call, according to the book Blood and Ivy by Paul Collins, and Parkman was already rich, so he didn't need that income to support his wife and 2 children. The medical work he tackled seemed motivated by genuine altruism. But before you get too sweet on Dr. Parkman, know that he could be a real prickly fella sometimes too. So much so that when he didn't return home on November 23, 1849, his wife and Kingsley, the servant, immediately feared the worst. At first, they tried to keep the situation quiet, discreetly visiting Parkman's tenants to ask when he'd last been around. They traced his movements to the grocery store, where they learned the bag of lettuce he had bought the day prior was still there waiting for him. Then they hit a wall. Kingsley knew that Parkman had one more appointment that day, but he didn't know who it was with. So they had to get the police involved.
News of his disappearance soon spread among the local people, and some sections of Boston's high society offered large rewards for information on his whereabouts.
This is from an episode of Briefcase.
Police thought that as he had many tenants who sometimes struggled to pay and sometimes were considered to be non-law-abiding people, that it was possible that one of his tenants had murdered and robbed him and then disposed of his body. The authorities instructed that the Charles River be dredged and an extensive search of the harbour. They also had the tenants' homes and nearby buildings searched. Despite this comprehensive search, Dr. Parkman's body was not found.
But the investigation wasn't totally fruitless. Tips started coming in, including one that put Parkman near Harvard's campus in the moments after he'd left Holland's grocery store. That, in turn, led police to a professor of chemistry named Dr. John White Webster. Like Parkman, Webster was a Harvard graduate. Unlike Parkman, he wasn't independently wealthy, though he kind of should have been. Here's a delightful 1950s CBS radio show called Crime Classics to help explain.
I have here a copy of the Boston Herald of the day. It gives Dr. Webster a neat spread on the front page and says, among other things, this. He was born in Boston about the year 1788. He came from a family of considerable wealth and respectability. When his father died, he inherited $40,000. I would just like to depart from the paper for a moment to tell you that when he inherited this money, eggs were 12 cents a dozen. $40,000 which he wasted, which he threw heedlessly away into the vortex of fashionable life. Money went, debts came, and so on.
So Webster hadn't been great at managing his inheritance, and now that it was gone, he was left to live on his Harvard salary, which paid garbage. Okay, not quite garbage, but it did not pay well. Webster made $1,200 a year. Now, that's $50,000 in today's money, which isn't quite poverty level for a family of 4, but Harvard at the time expected its professors to look and act as though they made big bucks, but did not provide them the funds to do that. In fact, in 1846, so 3 years before our story, Pietro Bacci was a veteran, well-respected Harvard professor. He was higher profile because he was the first Italian-born academic invited to teach at the elite college, Plus, he had written a number of textbooks during his tenure. Despite being well-liked by his students and a great teacher by all accounts, he was fired after 20 years with the school because he'd had the audacity to declare bankruptcy. Now, Bocce wasn't blowing his pay, to be clear. He lived in the city, not in Cambridge, in what author Collins described as mortifyingly cheap city digs. Collins wrote, quote, "Bocce's dismissal stood as a stark warning to the remaining instructors to remember who they were. Respectable Harvard gentlemen of sufficient means. To be revealed as anything less was to end one's career." End quote. Webster's own money woes began snowballing in the 1840s. With his inheritance, he'd built a home for his family among the elite in Cambridge, only to have to sell it because he couldn't afford the ongoing payments. By 1849, he was living in a rented home that was respectable, but by no means grand. He was struggling enough that he had asked for a loan from Dr. Parkman to make ends meet. That's what had led to his appointment with Parkman the afternoon of the disappearance. He was, in fact, the mystery man who had made a last-minute appointment with Parkman. He told police that he owed Parkman some $480, and Parkman had come to collect it at 1:30. Webster produced a receipt and said Parkman had left after their meeting, saying he was headed to the city clerk to record the payment. Webster invited the officers into his lab to search it, which they dutifully did. Nothing of note there. But they did notice that down the hall lived a Harvard caretaker named Ephraim Littlefield, who had a criminal past and a sinister side hustle. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Rocket Money. Hi, partner Scott. How many streaming services do you estimate I subscribe to?
All of them. Every single time I ask you to get such and such service, you already do. And sometimes you don't even remember that you do. But when we go to log in, there you are.
I know, it's kind of ridiculous. Some of them I use maybe twice a year. Rocket Money is helping me streamline things.
Which is good, because now that we've combined households, we already have to figure out which streamers we both separately subscribe to. We're just throwing money away left and right.
That's what's so great about Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. See? Look here.
Oh, so these are all your subscriptions. That's a lot.
Yep, Rocket Money's dashboard gives a clear view of my expenses across all of my accounts. And look here, it even helps me round up on my savings to squirrel away extra money a few bucks at a time. That little pot has grown to several $100s over the past year.
Guess that's why Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features.
Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/COTC today. That's rocketmoney.com/COTC, rocketmoney.com/COTC.
Get me Will Trent.
ABC Tuesday.
I don't even know where he is.
Will Trent is back.
You thought you could hide forever? Time to come home.
The series that's being called one of the best network procedurals.
We're gonna solve this case.
Featuring new cast member Gina Rodriguez.
I'm a prosecutor. We deal in truth and facts.
Maybe everybody should try that, huh?
Will Trent, the 2-part season premiere, begins Tuesday on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Ephraim Littlefield had worked for Harvard College for several years as a caretaker, or live-in janitor. He lived with his wife in the basement of the medical college, which, it's worth noting, was built atop land donated to the school by George Parkman. A bit of digging into Littlefield showed that he had been involved in some unsavory activities.
He knew Dr. Webster and the other Harvard doctors well. and would help them obtain dead bodies, which assisted in their study of medicine and human anatomy. He also cleaned the doctors' rooms and laboratories and started their fires for their furnaces.
In short, Littlefield did dirty work that professors wouldn't deign to do. Procuring dead bodies was certainly the most disturbing of the gigs. Harvard, like all American medical colleges at the time, needed cadavers to give its students important hands-on lessons. You might remember descriptions of the lucrative grave-robbing business in previous Crimes of the Centuries episodes. Boston, a largely Irish Catholic city that took umbrage to so-called resurrectionists, protected its graveyards better than some communities, making the procurement of corpses a bit tough. Harvard could sometimes get access to unclaimed indigent bodies, but the school needed more than what was available, so it had been quietly buying more on the Manhattan black market for years. It paid for the bodies by charging medical students a $5 fee for access to the dissecting room. Littlefield often worked as the procurer, a side hustle that largely went unnoticed, until May of 1848. That's when a young woman named Sarah Ferber left her Manchester, New Hampshire boarding house, never to return. Her body was soon found after in a Harvard dissecting room. Sarah had been having an affair with an older man, an aristocrat, who wasn't thrilled when he learned his young lover was pregnant. She went to get an illegal abortion, during which she died. The doctor, wanting to still make money off his patient, sold her to Harvard. A doctor there realized two things. First, this wasn't a body from the graveyard. She was too fresh. And second, the woman had died due to a pierced uterus. The doctor called the police. Littlefield, who had transported the corpse, had bribed the seller an extra $5, which would come back to haunt him as investigators now tried to unravel their latest mystery.
The police had made very little progress in finding what had happened to George Parkman, and the story of the missing doctor dominated the conversations of the Boston streets and in the shops. There were whispers that maybe the caretaker had something to do with the disappearance.
The rumors did not escape Littlefield, who had his own suspicions to share with police. Littlefield had lived down the hall from Dr. Webster's lab for some time. He routinely went into the lab, being one of the few other people with a key, so he could tidy it up and manage the furnace within it. Just before Thanksgiving Day, which, by the way, wasn't a national holiday yet in 1849, but was recognized in Massachusetts and several other states, Littlefield had noticed something odd about Webster. He had sent Littlefield on an errand that fell outside of his usual scope. Webster handed him a list of items to buy from a food shop in town and, uncharacteristically, also told Littlefield to grab a turkey as a gift for himself and his wife on Webster's dime. It was odd because someone else usually made these grocery store runs, and also odd because Webster had never given Littlefield a gift at all, much less one as generous as a turkey. He and his wife Caroline picked out a turkey and had the other meal items sent to Webster's home. Littlefield was given another odd task that day. Webster had him go to a supplier along the docks to pick up a chunk of alkaline quicklime. He had said, quote, "The piece should be as big as your head," end quote. This was so out of the way that Littlefield wasn't able to pull it off that day. He would have to go back after Thanksgiving. At first, he didn't think much of the strange errands, but once his name was attached as a possible suspect in Dr. Parkman's disappearance, he got more curious. He told police, "Hey, Dr. Webster's been acting pretty odd lately. Not only did he give me these weird errands and was unusually generous with the turkey, but he had also been stomping around his lab, keeping the door bolted so I can't get in, and firing up the furnace so hot that it burned my hand when I touched the exterior wall." One day, Littlefield said, the wall was so incredibly hot that he worried the building would catch fire. Most of the cops weren't sure about this. Of course, the suspected janitor would pin it on someone else. But how could he be stupid enough to try to blame a Harvard professor? But the janitor's tale at least planted a seed in some of the investigators' brains. First, though, they had to focus on finding Parkman. Littlefield didn't want to be right about Webster, but the more he thought about it and kept eye on the professor, the more certain he became. He had been nearby when police first searched Webster's lab the day they stopped to ask about Parkman's visit at 1:30. He had noticed that they didn't do a thorough search and seemed almost bashful about bothering the professor. One had even said, quote, "We can't believe for a moment, sir, that it's necessary to search your apartments," end quote. No confirmation bias there. Another officer asked about a specific room off the lab, and it was Littlefield who explained the room's purpose. That is Dr. Webster's private privy, he had said. The cops opted not to search it because it was, in short, gross. Modern-day plumbing was still a ways off for Harvard. Littlefield then led investigators into a trapdoor that gave access to crawl spaces underneath the building. They spotted nothing of note. Now, days later, Littlefield wanted to search those areas again, especially the privy. This is from a so-called ghastly dispatch from the Life and Death store in Salem, Massachusetts.
Ephraim Littlefield couldn't wait. He knew that when he had been in the laboratory, Dr. Webster was sort of protecting the privy, or the toilet at the time. And so he decided to get his wife to stand guard, Mrs. Littlefield, and Ephraim Littlefield decided to chip away at the privy wall until he could see inside.
This was a harrowing scene, if you can picture it. Littlefield had waited until Webster left his lab, then stationed his wife outside to serve guard. They had no idea when Webster was coming back. Then, Littlefield had to lower himself via the trapdoor into the crawl space and begin to chisel the brick wall at the mortar lines with an axe. And the reason he was doing all this was because he suspected Webster had killed Dr. Parkman, and if he was right, he had no idea how Webster might react if he was caught. Would Webster be mad enough to kill him? He had no clue. What he did know was that Webster kept a loaded pistol in his lab. Littlefield hacked at the privy wall for some time until his arms tired and his nerves frayed. He gave up for the evening after only removing a few bricks. The next morning, Webster paid him a visit. He walked into the Littlefield's home uninvited, picked up a newspaper, and paged through it. "Do you hear any further of Dr. Parkman?" he asked. Littlefield cautiously said no, he hadn't. Well, Webster had, he said. He'd heard that a woman had spotted a large and suspicious bundle being crammed into a cab. Police were investigating the lead now. Littlefield feigned interest. He still suspected Weber. He confided in another Harvard doctor, a new one on campus whom he trusted, Dr. Henry Bigelow, whose sister was about to become engaged to Dr. Parkman's son. Littlefield told Bigelow he planned to try to break into the wall of Webster's privy again. Bigelow, wanting to help solve the mystery for his soon-to-be in-laws, encouraged him. Police, meanwhile, were on another wild goose chase with a new tip by way of a poorly spelled note that said Parkman had been kidnapped by sailors. It was a stretch, to say the least. By this time, the rumors around campus and town weren't about Littlefield nearly as much. Plenty of people had started a whisper campaign that Dr. Webster was a viable suspect, so Littlefield got back to hacking away at the privy wall. He axed and hammered and chiseled, making a hole big enough to pry open with a crowbar. Then he lifted his lantern and saw chunks of flesh and muscle.
Get me Will Trent.
ABC Tuesday.
I don't even know where he is.
Will Trent is back.
You thought you could hide forever? Time to come home.
the series that's being called one of the best network procedurals.
We're going to solve this case.
Featuring new cast member Gina Rodriguez.
I'm a prosecutor. We deal in truth and facts.
Maybe everybody should try that, huh?
Will Trent, the 2-part season premiere, begins Tuesday on ABC and stream on Hulu.
You would think that finding a corpse jammed inside the walls of John Webster's private privy automatically meant that everyone knew they'd discovered the remains of the missing George Parkman. But remember, Harvard had a lot of bodies on its campus. So investigators had to be sure this wasn't merely a cadaver stored in a truly weird way en route to its time in the dissection room. In fact, they had to be sure the remains were even human. That confirmation came from Dr. Bigelow, who assured this disturbing find was no animal. That night, police quietly surrounded Webster's home. Quietly, because they didn't want to spook him and have him take flight. A lone officer called Durastus Clapp, how's that for a name, rapped on the door and was greeted by Webster wearing his slippers for the evening. Clapp said they were searching the college once again and asked if Webster would help for a moment. He happily obliged, then got a carriage ride to the jail, not the campus. Webster was suddenly less obliging. Clapp finally ended the charade. He said, quote, "You are now in custody on a charge of the murder of Dr. Parkman," end quote. To help explain what happened next, the CBS radio show again.
And they took Dr. Webster away, and they locked him up and held a trial for him. And in spite of his protestations, found him guilty.
Actually, that's too clean a summation. First, Webster wept for his wife and children. "What will they do?" he cried. "What will they think of me?" Then he demanded to know the evidence against him. Clapp wasn't straightforward, but he did say that his colleagues didn't need to keep searching for Dr. Parkman anymore. In other words, they'd found his body. Slowly, Webster pieced things together. The only way they'd found the body was through his lab, and the only person who had easy access to that was the janitor. He declared Littlefield a villain. "I'm a ruined man," he said, covering his mouth as if in horror. Then he started pacing the room. The next thing officers knew, his body had gone into a spasm and he was frothing at the mouth. He collapsed on a sofa. When officers tried to take him to a cell an hour later, he didn't have the strength to walk. He was sweating despite the coldness of the jail and his limbs had gone rigid. It was clear something was terribly wrong. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching the lab. After all, at this point, they were sure they had found some hunks of human in the wall, and while they were certain these were the remains of Dr. Parkman, they would still have to convince a jury as much. They worried that the rest of the man had been incinerated in the furnace that Littlefield said had been burning practically 24/7 at unusually high temps. One officer lifted the grate from the lab's furnace. Out spilled human teeth. Another officer searched the closets of the lab, where he found a tea chest filled with minerals. Webster was a collector of all things geological, and inside he had cushioned rock samples like green feldspar and chiasolite. The samples were layered too deep. The officer reached deeper still, and his fingers hit cold, wet flesh. He pulled out the tea chest from the closet and out-dumped a human torso. Now, as a crime reporter, I have learned, and been known to inappropriately mention at parties, that in criminal cases involving dismemberment, it's the torso that always seems to trip up the killer. I've covered at least 3 murder cases that likely would not have been solved had the culprit been able to dispose of the victim's torso, so my inappropriate party banter turns out to be as true today as it was in 1849. Anyway, the torso officers found had been gutted of its organs and viscera. Inside the hollowed part was jammed a chunk of the body's thigh. It was all wrapped up in twine as though it'd been prepped for roasting. Briefcase again.
The various remains were examined and found to be part of a single body that resembled the body of the missing Dr. Parkman. A dentist named Dr. Keep identified the false teeth found in the furnace as part of the set that he had prepared for the missing man.
Now, this dentist identification was a big deal. Never before in an American capital case had dental evidence been introduced in a trial. But Dr. Nathan Keep was so well acquainted with the piece found in the furnace that investigators were certain a jury would find it compelling. Police were sure they had a rock-solid case against Dr. Webster, but as their suspect fought some inexplicable illness at the jail, they faced a new question. Would he even survive to face trial? Yes, he would. After a few hours of mysterious symptoms, John Webster started regaining his strength and composure. Officers assumed that he had simply been overwhelmed by the stress of the situation and in fact felt sorry for him. Here was a learned man who'd always been well respected in Boston, not only being charged with a despicable crime, but buckling in such unmanly fashion. One guard even told him he pitied him. Webster insisted he had nothing to do with George Parkman's death, but when officers searched the very jacket he was wearing, they found evidence to the contrary. Inside his pocket was a scrawled note that went through the alibi he had given them previously. That, on the day he disappeared, Dr. Parkman had visited him and got upset about the $483 he was owed. But then there was another figure jotted down on the paper suggesting that Webster also owed Parkman another $2,432, which was more than twice Webster's annual pay. It turned out that Webster was far deeper in debt than anyone knew about, including his wife. He not only owed nearly $3,000 to Parkman between the two debts, but he owed other people too. He had used some of his furniture and mineral collections as collateral, and that, it seems, is what did him in. He had mortgaged one mineral set to Parkman, and then mortgaged it again to a friend of Parkman's. The two lenders compared notes one day and realized that they both had agreed to use the same item as collateral on loans to Webster. Parkman was furious. He demanded Webster pay back the money owed, and he wasn't polite or patient about it. He threatened the man's ruination. Remember, Pietro Bacci was fired for just declaring bankruptcy, for basically admitting he was poor. If Webster's money woes were made public, it would not only show he was poor, but also unscrupulous, what with using the same valuables as collateral in multiple loans. Plus, he knew something even Parkman didn't. He was in debt to several more people. When the trial began March 19, 1850, Webster still proclaimed his innocence. In fact, he said the janitor Littlefield was the true killer. Some high-profile folks agreed. Fanny Longfellow, wife to famed poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, also a Harvard professor, wrote a letter to her sister-in-law saying, quote, "Of course we cannot believe Dr. Webster guilty, bad as some of the evidence looks. Many suspect the janitor, who is known to be a bad man, and to have wished for the reward offered for Dr. Parkman's body." End quote. A Boston Times column called that kind of thinking an attempt to, quote, "throw a deed of blood from a man in high society upon the head of a poor man," end quote. The trial lasted 3 weeks and was covered voraciously by the press, both local and national. The demand for spectator seats in the courtroom was so great that people had to apply for spots. Priority was given to medical and law students, followed by seasoned pros in both fields. Journalists wrote stupid things that at the time seemed rooted in science. One analyzed Webster's appearance and decided that it betrayed his, quote, "strong animal passion and irascible temperament. His general appearance makes no favorable impression," end quote. Remember this the next time you read a story quoting supposed body language experts. Luckily, it was the evidence against Webster that led to his conviction. Jurors had deliberated well into the night, reaching their verdict at 10:40 p.m. When the foreman said guilty, Webster recoiled as if he'd been shot and then slouched into his chair, weeping. Littlefield was in the courtroom too, also crying. He told a reporter, quote, "If I was conscious of having uttered one single word that I have any doubt about, I would never forgive myself," end quote. The next day, Webster was sentenced to death. His lawyers fought back, to no avail. Webster wrote a letter to the governor asking for a pardon, saying he had never had anything but kind feelings toward Parkman and considered him a longtime friend. The governor didn't respond. Webster began meeting with a minister named George Putnam who would visit him in his cell. He said that in late May of 1850, so nearly 2 months after the trial ended, Webster confessed to the crime. He read the confession to a panel gathered to hear Webster's final appeal. According to Webster, as relayed by Reverend Putnam, Parkman confronted Webster in his lecture room, calling him a scoundrel and a liar. Parkman claimed to have helped Webster land his job at Harvard in the first place. "You see," he supposedly said, "I got you into your office, and now I will get you out of it." Webster tried to interject, but said he couldn't get a word in. He got angry and grabbed a nearby stick of wood, slamming Parkman in the head with all his might. Parkman fell, hitting his head again on the hard floor. He was motionless as blood began to trickle from his mouth. Webster said he rushed for some ammonia to use as smelling salts. He said, quote, "Perhaps I spent some 10 minutes in attempts to resuscitate him, but I found he was absolutely dead. In my horror and consternation, I ran instinctively to the doors and bolted them," end quote. Instead of going to the police, he decided to get rid of the body. Though he now only taught chemistry, he remembered enough anatomy from his med school days to make efficient work of the dismemberment. He burned Parkman's head in the furnace, as well as parts of his limbs. He hid other parts in the privy and the tea chest, waiting for the metaphorical heat to die down to finish the disposal. When he was arrested, he had a dose of strychnine on him that he took once they reached the jail. Officers had thought he had covered his mouth in horror at news he was being arrested. In reality, he was attempting suicide. But he had gotten the dose wrong and ended up frothing, writhing, and racked with pain all night, and was disappointed when he awoke the next day. Reverend Putnam pleaded that the panel spare Webster's life. While he had killed Parkman, the minister said, the confession showed it hadn't been premeditated, and if it hadn't been premeditated, surely Webster deserved to live. The confession shocked his family, especially his wife, who had steadfastly believed her husband when he had told her again and again he was innocent. His confession did not have the desired effect. People who had believed him before were now appalled, recalling how he had insisted Littlefield was the real killer. He knew damn well who had caused Parkman's death, whether by accident or otherwise, yet he blamed the poor janitor. Webster's death sentence stood. On August 30th, 1850, at Boston's Leverett Street Jail, he was publicly hanged. The sympathetic public set up a fund for his wife and daughters, who were not only humiliated by the scandal, but left impoverished by it too. Dr. Parkman's widow is said to have been the first person to contribute to the fund. To research this episode, I read Blood and Ivy, the 1849 Murder That Scandalized Harvard by Paul Collins, which is well worth the read. Highly recommend. I watched a few documentaries and enjoyed the campiness of that CBS radio program Crime Classics, which you can find on YouTube. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.